Welcome to History of the Netherlands, where we explore the events and characters that, over time, have transformed a swamp into an amazing modern marvel. Episode 52, Draining the Swamp, Part 2, Too Drained, Too Furious. Hello and welcome to the History of the Netherlands. In recent episodes, we have taken a departure from the trials and tribulations of the region's politics to discuss some of the more grassroots ideas, practices, and social developments that were making their marks on the history of the Netherlands as the 15th century rolled into the 16th. In this episode, we are going to get even more grassy and even more rooty as we continue on from a much earlier episode in discussing the ways that humans shaped the land and water around them, whilst endeavouring to live in what is, naturally, a pretty swampy wilderness. This episode is going to span a long period of time, much of which we have already delved into over the course of our journey. As podcasters, we've known for a long time that it behoves us to do a follow-up to an earlier episode on this topic. To reinforce this, we were given a kick in the backsides to do so promptly after having received some feedback from an intrepid listener named Edwin den Boer earlier this year. Edwin, hello if you are listening, commented on the loving and communal platform that is X that perhaps our recurring jokes about the Netherlands being our beloved boggy swamp were missing a crucial fact about what makes this part of Europe so special. The swampy ground upon which the towns are built and the people live is arguably far less important to the region than the huge river systems, being those of the Rhine, the Maas, and the Scheldt, which flow through our beloved boggy swamp and empty out into the sea here. Edwin argues, not unreasonably, that instead of declaring our love for our swamp, we should instead be expressing our enthusiasm for our delta. And Edwin, you make a valid point. However, I am going to counter it with two of my own. Firstly, talking about our delta as Australians would make us look like giant fanboys of Delta Goodrum, which I most certainly am not. Julian, are you a fanboy of Delta Goodrum?
No, not me, not I.
Secondly, simply put, there is no equivalent and as satisfying Delta-related word as sphagnum. I just really like the mouthfeel of it. Sphagnum. With that being said, despite these 2 points, Edwin is correct in that we do need to explore further how the waterways, the water management processes, shipping and trade for which the Netherlands would become renowned all grew from the context of people living in what I am sure we can all agree, Edwin, can be called a beautiful, swampy river delta. So here we go. Between the years 1000 and 1500 CE, the soggy sphagnum-filled boglands of the western Low Countries were terraformed to support human habitation, and as such, the seeds of future prosperity and hardships were simultaneously, albeit unknowingly, sown. Draining the swamp meant that land was created for agriculture, farming, and settlement. This land was crisscrossed by waterways over which products, both domestic and foreign, could be moved on boats from the sea to the rivers and vice versa. Draining the swamp also meant that those lands sank due to oxygen seeping into the pierced mass of moss and rotting the previously petrified peat within. People had to invent things like pumping mills to move water out of the swamp and to stave off that waterlogged sinking feeling they had been experiencing. By the start of the 16th century, towns in the Low Countries had become important hubs of commercial shipping, with boats sailing from northern Germany and beyond to the Baltic Sea, preferring to use the relatively calm and peaceful waters inside the dunes, as they would say, of Holland to reach markets in Flanders, as opposed to risking the open waters of the North Sea. Although water management required cooperation between the peoples of different towns, all of this economic activity also naturally created competition and rivalry between these towns, particularly in Holland, as they literally fought over their rights to do things like dig new canals, build new locks, and charge tolls. It's Draining the Swamp, Part 2. Too Drained, Too Furious. Part 1 was way back in episode 8 of this podcast, entitled Draining the Swamp, or the Secret Soggy Story of Sphagnum. In that episode, we first discussed how in the 11th century, colonists began to settle in the wet wildernesses of places like Holland, Utrecht, and Flanders, at the encouragement of the nobility of those areas. We explored how these colonists would chop sphagnum, or peat moss, out of the ground and create long parallel ditches to drain water out of the bogs and into a river, creating land on which they could live and farm happily while paying rent, taxes, and tolls to those nobles in return. It seemed like a win-win situation. Unfortunately, however, the boggy landscape began to sink as it dried out and rotted from the inside, while continual human interference in the river systems, such as with the construction of dams upstream, combined with heavy sedimentation to cause the mouth of the Oude Rhine River near Katwijk to silt up and eventually become completely closed following a storm in 1163. Being unable to escape to the sea, all of that water from the river had nowhere else to go, and it quickly began to threaten the newly created lands as its levels rose. If you can recall, we discussed how in 1165 the Count of Holland, Floris III, decided the best course of action was to build a dam at a place called Zwammerdam, which would basically stop the water from entering Holland and instead let it become Utrecht's problem. Brilliant idea according to Holland. Not so brilliant according to Utrecht, whose people understandably kicked up a fuss. After an intervention by no less than the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the dam was removed, but instead 2 big drainage canals called the Zeil and the Doos were dug. These then moved the water from south to north through the Leidse Meer and the Haarlemmermeer and eventually out into the Zuider Zee via the Spaarne and the Ij rivers. This is often seen as the beginning of the Rhineland Water Board, the body which would become, and still partly is, responsible for water management in this part of Holland. Since digging such major works required cooperation between the 15 different rural districts that the waters ran through. That was pretty much where we left things in that episode, but now we are finally going to head back to Holland and Utrecht to see how the water management systems developed over the next few hundred years, in the background of the internecine conflicts and social development about which we have spoken so much since episode 8. A lot of the following information is coming from a 2003 article called Rhineland and Woorden by Gerard van de Ven, who was a special professor of water management history at the University of Amsterdam. As usual, there is conflicting and contrasting information about a lot of these points, since historians love splitting hairs about water management projects completed hundreds of years ago. So if you think we misdate your favorite canal by 100 years, don't blame us, blame Gerard van de Ven. After the digging of the Zeil and the Doos, it turned out that they weren't by themselves enough to adequately drain water from the south to the lakes further north. So in 1202, the Count of Holland decided to build a dam at Zwammerdam again. This time, however, there were proper negotiations undertaken between the various parties from Holland and Utrecht to try to reach an agreement on how to deal with the water. The Count of Holland stipulated that the dam at Zwammerdam would be taken away on the proviso that the lands of Utrecht, whose waters emptied into the Oude Rhine, pay for a third set of drainage ditches to be dug. Collectively, these ditches would eventually be known as the Heimanswetering. In addition to this, those lands in Utrecht then built their own dam, which could be opened and closed to control the flow of water, so that water from Utrecht wouldn't flow uncontrolled into Holland during high water periods. These projects were sufficient for the Count of Holland to swear under oath in 1204 to never build a dam in Zwammerdam again. We can call this a dam oath. As we also mentioned in the first Draining the Swamp episode, Water management issues required cooperation and compromise between individuals, villages, and entire regions whose other interests besides not drowning were often not aligned with each other. That they could cooperate on this particular issue is no doubt a testament to water's uncompromising nature. You can't just say to a river, "Hey, river, could you please not flood me today?" Well, you can, but the river isn't going to listen. As such, dealing with your annoying neighbors, who could well also be your arch rivals, could be the only other course of option available to you if all of you want to not drown in a giant flood one day. The time period roughly between the 10th and the 13th centuries is labeled de grote ontginning, or the Great Reclamation, in Holland and Utrecht, since this was when people got to work draining the boglands and reclaiming land. Throughout the last century of the Great Reclamation, the push and pull between conflict and cooperation in dealing with water issues literally shaped the development of Holland and Utrecht and the relationships between the peoples and communities who lived in those lands. One of the big issues which people in those lands faced was not only getting the water out of marshy areas, but also to ensure that the water from the outside couldn't get in. For this reason, the places in which drainage canals emptied into outside waters were highly concerning, since at high tide or during storms, there was always a threat that the outside water might rise up and make itself an unwanted guest, pushing back through these drainage ditches into the town or the settlement. As such, in the 1220s, it was decided to dam the waterways which emptied into the Leidse Meer from the south and instead regulate the emptying of the water into that lake via a complex of 7 locks through one of its surrounding borders, a wall called the Vendeldijk, which ran along its southeastern edge. A treaty was concluded in 1226 between Bishop Otto II of Utrecht and Count Floris IV of Holland, in which it was agreed that what they referred to as the lands of Woerden in Utrecht would pay for 3 of those 7 locks and their annual upkeep. This is often seen as the beginning of the Groot Waterschap van Woerden, or the Woerden Water Board, although that wouldn't be officially founded until a century later in 1322. In the winter between 1248 and 1249, a series of 3 giant storms ravaged the Low Countries between November and February, causing storm surges which broke open dikes and flooded areas of Friesland, Holland, and Groningen. An account of one of these storms was recorded in the Chronicle of Witteverum by a guy called Menko, who was the abbot of a pre-Monstratensian monastery named Bloemhof. We are going to quote from it now, Julian having translated this into English from a Dutch translation from Latin, which was provided by Rudy Kunzel in his article In Vurige Draag in Menko's Chronique. Quote, "In the beginning of 1249, the west wind, in contrast to the gentleness that is proper to it, roaring like a north wind, increased terribly at night, and became so strong in the early part of the night that such a roar of winds has not been heard for ages. The roofs of many houses were torn off, some even new and strong ones collapsed, and everywhere nothing was heard but sorrow and grief. Furthermore, around midnight, a glittering light was seen in the sky, which sparkled somewhat. Some thought it was lightning, but no thunder followed. Others thought it was a dragon. Isidore says in his Book of Origins that dragons are usually fiery by nature and rise in storms. But since he, the dragon, is accustomed to be born and live in the hottest part of Ethiopia, we would rather modestly leave it in the middle what splendor this was than to presumptuously pronounce a judgment on it. This, however, we have learned that in all of Friesland, wherever he, the dragon, was seen, everyone perceived him at a distance of a throw of a glade, and that he disappeared there into the earth. At the first cockcrow, the north wind followed the west wind, and thus the storminess of the sea broke the dikes, the water covered the land, and everywhere there was sorrow and sighing. But the Father of mercies, the God of all comfort, who is angry and has mercy, softened his anger in the midst of the chastisement, for if the north wind had replaced the west wind just before, during the highest level of seawater, and had continued with as much force, Friesland would hardly have survived." End quote. Got to keep your eye out for a north wind. These same storms also ravaged Holland, breaking through sea dunes nearby Calensburg and Schagen and flooding the north of Holland. This was no doubt partly what spurred people in that area to build what became known as the Westfriese Omringdijk, that system of dikes which encircled a large swath of North Holland. It offered them great protection from the water, though we're unsure how good it was against dragons. These storms illustrated how vulnerable Holland was south of the Eye, so that the mouth of the Sparna River was dammed to stop seawater from entering into the countryside. 9 locks were installed to control the flow of water and to allow ships to pass through. By this stage, the Rhineland Water Board had grown in area compared to the Vorden one, so it was agreed that Rhineland would pay for 6 of the locks, with Vorden paying for the other 3. Fast forward nearly 4 decades, and on February 18th, 1286, the now Count of Holland, Floris V, signed a charter which created a whole lot of regulations for the water management of the Rhineland area. It is pretty important to remember at this point, the lands, or swamps really, which we have been talking about, were pretty much like a cold, boggy, green Wild West, with lots of birds and far fewer coyotes. In fact, no coyotes. It was a wilderness, with no set borders, not even between the areas which the Count of Holland and the Bishop of Utrecht laid claim to. In this aforementioned charter, then, Floris explicitly laid out the boundaries that would come to define the Rhineland Water Board, being the Spaarndammer Dike in the north, the Zwammerdam in the east, and a dike between Wassenaar and Voorschoten in the south, called the Hoeven-Zijtwinde. This dike, which sits just north of The Hague, would later become known as the Landscheiding, or land division, between the Rhineland and the Delftland water boards. When this charter was written, the water levels south of the land division, in Delftland, were actually 1 meter lower than those in the Rhineland, making this a pretty obvious place to set a boundary. There would, however, be violent conflict at this boundary in later centuries, which we will talk about later in this episode. As mentioned earlier, one of the consequences of the Great Reclamation was that as water drained out of the peaty marshlands, they began to sink. If the lands sank to the same level as the waters into which they were draining, they would become waterlogged and unusable. Unless you're a frog. By 1285, this sinking had led people in the southern Rhineland area to realize that they needed to find a new way to get water out of their swamp. In that year, Floris V ordered a dam to be built where the Hollandse IJssel River branched off from the Lek River, nearby a place called Hoppenesse. The Lek is a continuation of the Neder-Rhine River, which is itself one of the lower branches of the Rhine River in the Netherlands. The location of this dam actually sat on lands controlled by the Bishop of Utrecht, John of Nassau, and was protested against vehemently by the chapters of Utrecht. They were large landowners in the area and as such would be expected to contribute to funding the construction of the dam. If it was built, it would have great consequences for the Lek River, since it would increase the amount of water flowing down it. As a result, there would be an increased risk of flooding and dikes along the Lek River would have to be strengthened, requiring further works and expense. This would prove to be prescient when the Lek did break open 3 times in 1321 and 1322, causing flooding throughout Holland and Utrecht. To stop more flooding, a new 5-kilometer long winter dike was built 400 meters behind the summer dike. This then gave the river space to flood into at moments of high water. A lot of places around the world today are investigating and utilizing the concept of giving room for rivers as they experience higher amounts of water flowing through their rivers due to the effects of climate change. The Dutch have been doing it for almost 700 years already. If you've been paying attention, I bet you knew that giving room for rivers was Dutch. Damming the Hollandse IJssel also had consequences for ship traffic in the area, since boats could no longer sail from that river into the Lek. If you are able to remember back to episode 11, the murder of Floris V, John of Nassau was not a very shrewd operator financially, and he had required Floris's help to quell an uprising in his lands a decade earlier. This is how Flores was able to buy John's permission to build the dam, basically by giving him £4,500 and telling him he was going to build a dam. The construction took place between March and November each year until it was completed 4 years later in 1289. The chapters of Utrecht remained very unhappy with this for years, and it wasn't until 1296 that they finally reached a settlement with the Bishop John of Nassau about the dam, after they too had received a bit of compensation from the Count of Holland. The dam at Hoppenesse, which is now known as Dam bij het Klaphek, created a problem for the city of Utrecht. Ships sailing from Utrecht could no longer easily get onto the Rhine River and thus into Germany. Previously, they had sailed down a canal which had been dug in 1122 called the Vaartse Rijn, from which they could get to the Hollandse IJssel, then to the Lek. This new dam could potentially have dire consequences for the economic position of the town. To counter these possible consequences, another new canal was dug, which would then become known as the Nieuwe Vaart, the new route. This then connected the Vaartse Rijn to the Lek. The digging of the Nieuwe Vaart was also met by protestations from landowners in that area, who were also unhappy about their land being confiscated for what they saw as low-ball offers by the city of Utrecht. In a charter issued on the 12th of December 1289, Floris V demanded that 4 of these landowners, their names being Willem van den Slikker, Willem van Oudegein, and Arnold van Amstel, and Spronk, hand over their lands to the city of Utrecht for values which were determined by him. The charter ended with, quote, "and whoever did not do that, we would hold it against him," end quote, which isn't even a veiled threat, it's just a full-on threat. The canal was dug before the dispute with the landowners had been settled. In an article entitled Novus Renus, Aanleg en Betekenis van de Nieuwe Vaart, historian Kai van Vliet explains how for years afterwards the dispute dragged on. Willem van den Slikker refused to give up his rights and was eventually killed in a battle on the Nieuwe Vaart by soldiers from Utrecht, where his son was taken prisoner. This son gave up his rights to the lands, but another of Willem's sons, named Gijsbrecht, refused to settle. A deal was eventually brokered between his estate and the city of Utrecht by the Count of Gelders in 1334, but only after Gijsbrecht had also been killed at the Nieuwe Vaart. That's almost half a century of angst, fighting, and death over the digging of a canal. Don't know what happened to Spronk, though. To ensure that water from the Lek River would not enter into the Nieuwe Vaart, a dam was placed close to where the two waterways met at a place called Vreeswijk. This would become a so-called overtoom, a location where boats would be dragged over a dike to get from one waterway to another. To imagine what an overtoom would look like, picture a levee or a dike or a wall, and perpendicular to the way that it's running, there's a ramp running up it on one side and down the other. Rollers were placed at regular intervals to help smoothly get the boat out of the water and up and over the dike. At the top of this levee, a windlass was constructed, which is basically a frame that has a big horizontal beam with a rope wound around it that can be rotated by a hand crank. The windlass would do the work of pulling the boats up the ramp over the overtoom, and the Bishop of Utrecht would earn a nice, pretty penny from it. When the overtoom was eventually replaced by a wooden lock in 1373, the Vaartse Rijn would become one of the most important waterways in the Netherlands, right up until the 19th century. It became part of the Koolse Vaart, which connected Amsterdam to Germany, and as the name implies, Kolen or Cologne, via the city of Utrecht. The building of the lock in 1373 made the water level easier to control and also made it so that ships and goods could get through this area much more easily since everything didn't need to be pulled up the overtoom. It also meant that Vreeswijk could become a town whose economy revolved around the lock. This was a big deal since boats would often have to wait for a long time before they were able to use a lock. Crews would need a place to eat and drink, to stay the night and do business. Vreeswijk became a bustling outer harbour of Utrecht. The biggest consequence of damming the Hollandse IJssel off from the Lek was that the water level in the Hollandse IJssel dropped. The only fresh water feeding into it was now water draining out of the surrounding lands, and a canal called the Doorslag, which connected it to the Vaartse Rijn. After being dammed off, the water level in the river was much more affected by tides. The Hollandse IJssel empties into the Maas River at Rotterdam, only a short distance away from where that river empties into the North Sea. As such, much like the Maas, the Hollandse IJssel became a tidal river. At high tide, seawater would enter into the system and raise the level, while at low tide it would drop dramatically. One immediate benefit of this was that the Hollandse IJssel became a perfect place to drain the surrounding peatlands into at low tide. Remember that many of the drained marshlands had actually sunk to the old waterline, but now since the water would get even lower at low tide, there was even more opportunity for more draining to be done. Praise be the drainers. To take advantage of this new situation, throughout the 14th century, people occupying the lands between the Oude Rijn and the Hollandse IJssel, from the dam at Hoppenesse to Gouda, began to dig new drainage canals towards the Hollandse IJssel. Where those waterways connected to the river, sluice gates were installed, so the water could not enter during high tide but could flow out at low tide. Like all big water management projects, this was a communal effort. Villages and farming communities which were close to each other were required to work together so that they could fund and carry out these projects. To make sure that only those who had actually contributed to the effort could benefit from it, they would surround their lands with low-lying dikes so that no water from outside could come in. The water level within this diked-off area thus became regulated and could be controlled by opening and closing the sluice gate. These diked-off areas with their own regulated water level became known as polders, and water boards were set up within the polders to administer and manage all the water-related affairs within them, which is pretty much all affairs. Unfortunately, however, damming off the Hollandse IJssel also had the side effect of dramatically speeding up the silting of the river. As seawater entered into the river at high tide, it brought with it clay sediments which would be deposited along the riverbanks and raise the riverbed. This clay would prove useful for making what would become famous yellow IJssel bricks. As an aside, in case you are scared that we are going to neglect something so important to the Netherlands as bricks, we are planning to do an episode or possibly a series of episodes one day about bricks and clay. But for now, let's just leave it to Bart Ibelings, who wrote in his essay about the silting up of the Hollandse IJssel, quote, "It is remarkable that the millions of bricks that were baked here annually did not lead to sufficient deepening of the river," end quote. This, combined with subsidence within the polder, meant that soon it was no longer possible to use the low tide in the river to empty water out of the polders. New methods had to be invented. First, people did it by hand, using balers, buckets. Soon, though, pumping mills were installed, which needed muscle power to move water up out of the polder and into the river. The first mills were either powered by people, either by hand or by treadmills. Imagine humans in a big hamster wheel, or animals such as horses and donkeys. In 1408, the first wind-powered mill was demonstrated in Alkmaar by Floris van Alkemade and Jan Gruitenzoon, and these would later come to symbolize the Dutch efforts to drain the boggy swamp. But we will save that for a later episode, which will probably be called Draining the Swamp Part 3, Windmill Drift. For now, unfortunately, we have reached a dam on our journey, and now we must cross an overtome in the form of an ad break. The only good thing about it is that the Bishop of Utrecht won't be getting a penny. On the other side, we will take a look at how the silting up of the river also had ramifications on the all-important shipping route which traversed across Holland, the so-called Doorvaart binnen Dune, the sailing route inside the dunes. Welkom terug. Welcome back. As mentioned at the start, this episode is mostly being written in response to a comment by Edwin den Boer earlier this year, which pointed out how the delta aspect of the Netherlands was more important and relevant to its history and economic prosperity than the land in between the rivers. Edwin is, of course, Absolutely correct in the fact that the Low Countries is a gigantic delta region and that this has been a defining feature and critical component leading to the prosperity and development which has taken and will continue to take place in the Low Countries throughout our story. During the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, the river systems in the Low Countries, such as the IJssel, Vecht, Amstel, and Sparne, became increasingly important as a way to move goods coming from the Baltic region into the more southern regions of the Low Countries, such as Flanders and Brabant, or into Germany. Sailing along the coasts of the Low Countries was dangerous due to shallow waters and sandbanks and treacherous weather. Also, as we saw in episode 23, overachieving Overijsselers and Holland versus Hansa, when regional North Sea powers went to war with one another, the North Sea often became unsafe for any ships to sail, regardless of which flags they were flying. This was mainly due to privateering, which was state-approved piracy, yar. As such, moving goods along internal waterways such as rivers, lakes, and canals was a safer and more reliable option than navigating the sea. Before the middle of the 13th century, the only real inland north-south route which existed in the Low Countries was one that went via the Vecht River and the city of Utrecht. In 1244, Willem II, the Count of Holland, issued a charter in which he sold the right to drain the marsh in a place called Waddingsveen. In this charter, he explicitly mentioned that a canal was to be dug that would connect the Gouwe River to the Oude Rhine in South Holland. Digging this canal would help drain water out of the area around Waddingsveen, but it also created the possibility for ships to sail through Holland's internal waterways from north to south or vice versa. After this canal was dug in the middle 13th century, ships could sail from the Zuiderzee south towards Amsterdam, then west towards Spaandam and onto the Sparne River, past Haarlem and into the Haarlemmermeer and the Leidsemeer through the Heimansvetering, which we spoke about earlier in this episode, into the Oude Rhine and then onto the Gouwe, past Gouda and into the Hollandse IJssel. Once on the Hollandse IJssel, ships could either sail up the Lek and Rhine towards Gelderland and Germany, or they could go downstream until they reached the Maas, from which they could either go out to sea past Rotterdam and Briel, or go further south towards the Oosterschelde and Zeeland, Flanders, and Brabant. From there, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump, and you're in France. Simply put, digging this canal made it possible for ships to sail from the north of France safely through Holland onto the Zuiderzee, from which they could then hug the coast of Germany and head up towards Denmark. This route through Holland would later become known as gecostumeerde binnenvaart, which, when you put it into Google Translate, comes out as costumed inland shipping. That's hilarious, because then we could just imagine a bunch of people in the 13, 14, and 1500s LARPing while on boats. Unfortunately, though, it actually is more related to customs, like the shit kind that you get at airports, meaning something more like legally regulated inland shipping route. Boring. It was also known as the Doorvaart binnen Dune. Dune being the old school word for duinen, meaning dunes. So the passage inside the dunes, which is nicely poetic. So that's what we're going to keep calling it. Even if it does bring up false images of giant, all-consuming worms destroying spice mining encampments on a planet in space. The benefits of taking this north-south route, the passage inside the dunes through Holland, were quickly realized by shippers not only from Holland, but also from further abroad, since it was much easier to follow this route than the old one via the Vecht River through Utrecht. The amount of ships sailing through here also came to the attention of the Count of Holland. He liked money, so tolls were introduced so that the Commonwealth coffers could also profit from all of these boats on Holland's waterways. One toll would have to be paid for the so-called salt waters at Heerfleet, nearby Rotterdam. Once on the fresh waters of the passage inside the dunes, a toll would then be paid at Spaandam in the north, at Alphen in the middle to use a lock called the Gouwe Sluis, and at Moordrecht in the south. The town of Gouda is located where the Gouwe and the Hollandse IJssel rivers meet. Lying right in between Utrecht and Holland, Gouda was of strategic importance. So on July 19, 1272, Count Floris V granted city rights to Gouda in order to ensure its loyalty remained to him. In this charter, ships from Gouda were granted exemption from tolls on waterways in Holland, so they wouldn't have to pay that toll at Moordrecht nor at Spaandam. The town was clearly interested in ensuring that international shipping would sail on the internal route through Holland, and this went back a number of years. Earlier in 1243, the previous Count of Holland, Willem II, had offered protection to merchants from Hanover and Lubeck if they would pay the toll at Geervliet for cloth purchased in Flanders and then sail it through his territory. One of the people who acted as a witness to this declaration was a guy called Dirk van der Gouda, a pretty clear sign that the economic potential of this location was not lost on those who were settling there early. Around the year 1250, an artificial waterway called de Haven, or the harbour, was constructed which connected the Gouwe River to the Hollandse IJssel. A lock was installed at the top of de Haven, which came to be known as de Donkere Sluis, the Dark Lock, and the embankments were built up on either side of de Haven. This was to be the nucleus around which the town of Gouda would develop. It is unclear exactly when, but probably at some point before the year 1330, the Kommetal toll was moved from Moordrecht to Gouda. From that point on, it became the central hub of the official shipping route through Holland, sanctioned by the Count of Holland. From 1413, the right to charge the toll was rented out by the Count of Holland to whoever bid the highest amount. This person would then have the responsibility of actually collecting the toll and also get to live in a fancy toll house, which sounds pretty sweet and unlikely in the current housing climate. At the other end of the route, the toll remained in the hands of Spaandam until 1429, when the town of Haarlem took it over. With the toll points firmly established along the passage inside the dunes, this became the only legal route by which ships could pass north-south through Holland. The three cities which profited the most from this route were Haarlem, Gouda, and Dordrecht. The first two because of the lucrative toll money which was earned there, and the latter because it lies just to the south of the passage inside the dunes, just southeast of Rotterdam. Dordrecht had been granted a staple right for all goods transported by ship down the Lek and the Merwede rivers in 1299. By 1340, Dordrecht had also added the Maas River to this. These staple rights basically meant that any ship which was in the vicinity of Dordrecht would have to first stop there, offer their goods for sale at Dordrecht's market, mostly being wine, wood, grain, and salt, and only then after 14 days, which was later shortened to 8, would that ship be able to continue. Dordrecht would send armed ships called uitleggers out onto the water to search for anyone who might try to evade the toll and then drag them back to the town. They would then have to pay the toll, plus a fine, or even in the worst case scenario for them, have their ships and goods completely confiscated. Some people claim that this is the reason why Dordrecht gets slandered in a Dutch expression, which goes, "Hoe dichter bij Dort, hoe rotter het wordt." The closer to Dordrecht, the more rotten it gets. It won't surprise you to learn that lots of Dutch people hate paying taxes, and so many towns in Holland protested heavily over centuries about the Dordrecht staple right. Foreshadowing. There were, of course, exemptions paying the Kommetal tolls. Tolls would not be charged on some specific commodities or would not be charged to people from specific towns. Amsterdam and Leiden, for example, had been granted exemption from tolls in privileges issued to them by the Count of Holland. Hanseatic merchants from northern Germany or from the Baltics were also given a special rate for the passage inside the dunes. Historian J.H.A. Boken provides an example of this in his essay, De Hanse and Vlaanderen, in which he quotes a 15th century instruction from the Court of Audit sent to the toll collector Wouter Antszoon in Gouda. Quote, "Such goods and merchant ships as may be brought from the east or north," meaning northern Germany and the Baltic, "and which go westward or southward through Gouda, they shall be free from paying the tolls at Gouda, provided that they show the toll collector a sign that they have paid the toll at Spaandam." End quote. The same applied vice versa at Spaandam. If you paid it at Gouda, you wouldn't have to pay it there. So basically, people with this privilege, being shippers from the north and the east, only had to pay the toll once on the journey, which is like a 50% discount. That's more than just a pretty sweet deal. That's Humster. That's almost in the bonus. Because of this, merchants from those areas naturally preferred to use the passage inside the dunes instead of risking the journey across the North Sea, and they did so until late into the 15th century. The town of Gouda profited greatly from the passage inside the dunes. It was a notorious bottleneck along the route, since De Haven was quite a small passage, and the lock, the Donkere Sluis, was also very small. Ships would have to wait a long time before they were allowed to use the lock, meaning that they were basically forced to spend a night in the town. So people would get off their ships, go and spend their money at Gouda buying provisions, fix their ships there, and also do all the things that sailors are notorious for doing. So like backgammon. All of this led to grumbling from others in Holland, since this small bottleneck was so busy it caused extensive delays. There wasn't really an alternative way for boats to move north-south across the territory because other waterways which travelled in that direction had been closed off. This was often because of the landscheidingen, the land divisions, which were those internal dikes that had been created to keep the different waterboards separate from one another. In the Vliet, which is a canal between Delft and Leiden, there were two dams, one called the Korstanje, nearby Delft, and another called the Leidschendam, nearby Leiden. In the Rotte River between Rotterdam and the Oude Rhine, there was a dam called the Hildam. In between Leiden and Amsterdam on the Drecht River was a dam called the Bilderdam. Whilst in between Alphen and Amsterdam, there was a dam on the Aar River, creatively named the Aar Dam. It's the favourite one of pirates. Obviously, it is not possible to sail through a dam. So in these places, there would often be an overtoom, like we described in the first part of this episode, a construction that enabled you to drag your boat from one body of water over a dike or dam into another. These waterways were also often very small, and ships would have to be unloaded and dragged across the overtoom and then pay fees associated with that. This made it impractical for large ships to sail this way. In an essay which we have used a lot to write this part of the episode, whose sexy title translates as The Conflict for Inland Shipping Through the Middle of Holland in the 15th and 16th Century, historian J.C. Smith explains how in 1435 there was a disagreement about these fees between the city of Leiden and a nobleman called Willem van Naaldwijk. He held the rights to charge for the use of an overtoom over the Leidschendam, which blocked the way between Leiden and Delft. Due to this disagreement and its eventual resolution, we actually have a very good idea of what products were being pulled over the overtoom and how much was being paid for them. This includes stuff like wine, beer, grain, cloth, wool, wood, furniture, stone, skins, pigs, hay, herring, alum, glass, mead, and dyes. But if you turned up with nothing in your ship, well, I've got bad news for you. There was also a fee for dragging empty boats across because, well, you know, if you're a greedy noble, you may as well get as much money as possible whenever you possibly can. In fact, about the only exemption in the whole process was that you wouldn't have to pay for what, quote, one man can carry in his own arms, end quote. Which makes me think you'd really just want to find the Obelix to your Asterix to just carry as much stuff over for you as they can. As we mentioned at the end of the first part of this episode, after the dam at Hoppenesse was built, the Hollandse IJssel River began to silt up. As that river became shallower, it meant that the shipping channel which ships could safely sail on became much smaller. It got to the point that a fully loaded boat would be unable to tack into a headwind since there simply wasn't enough space to do so. It also meant the harbour in Gouda was much shallower as well. In his essay on this topic, Bart Ibelings explains how measures were taken in Gouda by the Count of Holland in 1452 and 1466 to deal with these issues. There is a record of money being paid to the lock operators to store large amounts of water within the lock and then at low tide to dump it into the harbour to try to clear it of silt. All of this led to further delays for ships sailing on the passage inside the dunes, and soon towns began to press for new alternative routes to be built. Basically, every town in Holland wanted new routes to be opened, except for Gouda, Haarlem, and Dordrecht, which were the three profiting greatly from the status quo. An early example of this occurred in the beginning of the 15th century nearby the town of Amsterdam. As the Hollandse IJssel began to silt up and the polders of the Rhineland waterboard sank, Rhineland began searching again for new ways to drain water northwards into the Eye. In 1413, the Count of Holland gave permission to the Rhineland waterboard to build a new drainage canal that would connect an offshoot of the Haarlemmermeer, creatively called the Nieuwe Meer, to the Eye, just to the west of the town of Amsterdam. A new lock would have to be built through the Spaarndammer in order to let the water from the lake system travel north and empty out into the sea. The town of Amsterdam was vehemently against this lock being built, since it meant that if an enemy was to gain control of the lock, they could use it to literally drown the town. As such, after the completion of the waterway and the lock, the town of Amsterdam just built a dam behind the locks, rendering the whole thing useless. Despite the efforts of the Rhineland waterboard, the passage remained closed. The entire endeavor became nothing more than a waste of money. This waterway became and still is known as the Kostverloren Vaart, or the Sunk Cost Canal. About 20 years after this, Amsterdam decided to widen a drainage canal which led from Amsterdam to the Kostverloren Vaart, so that ships would be able to sail directly from the town to the Haarlemmermeer and on to Leiden. At the place where the two waterways met was an overtoom straddling the divide between the Rhineland and the Amstelland waterboards. Haarlem was incredibly unhappy about this, since it threatened to create a bypass which ships could use to get around paying the Commercial toll for the passage within the dunes, and so they took legal action against Amsterdam with the Count of Holland. In the meantime, they had giant poles slammed into the overtoom so the boats couldn't actually use it. The city of Amsterdam, showing characteristic behavior by now, removed the poles and then just decided to make it a full-on water passageway through the overtoom so the boats could just go through. Because of this, in 1434, the Count of Holland fined the city and had a dam built on the Kostverloren Vaart to stop boats from being able to use it and so bypass the toll. We will finish today's episode with probably the most famous example of armed conflict over these projected and dreamt of new shipping routes. After decades of complaining to the court of Holland, the town of Delft was finally able to convince Maximilian von Habsburg, the by now Count of Holland, of the necessity of bettering its connection to the north. Due to the Leidschendam on the Vliet between Delft and Leiden, and the Hildam on the Rotte River, ships wanting to sail north from Delft were forced to make ridiculously long detours that actually took them south, and then east, and then north. In 1489 and 1491, Maximilian granted permission to the Rhineland and Delftland waterboards to install locks in those dams that would improve the shipping routes from Delft, allowing ships just to go straight north. This led to much grief within the town of Gouda, since fewer ships would need to dock at the haven, use the Donkere Sluis, and as such, this would threaten that city's most important source of income. So when these sluices were built, making things easier for ships from Delft, well, people from Gouda decided to take action. And in the middle of winter, January 19th, 1492, 400 angry and drunk men from Gouda and Dordrecht jumped on sleighs and sledded towards the locks to get them some retribution. And before we get on with this story, speaking of sleighs, that brings us to, ding, 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 very late in this episode, your favorite and our least favorite part of the show. Bet you didn't know that was Dutch. The English word sleigh, as in dashing through the snow on a one-horse open, as opposed to what you do when you play aggressive thrash guitar for a slayer, is derived from a Dutch word, sleigh, which was introduced to North American English via Dutch migrants. So there you go, sleigh. Bet you didn't know that was Dutch. To continue this story of our 400 drunk and angry men on sleighs, we are going to let historian J.C. Smith describe how the action unfolded. Quote, "They went by sleigh across the snowy and frozen fields and waterways to the Hildam and the crossing between Leiden and Delft and destroyed both new openings. According to the Gouda city accounts, its municipal contingent consisted of 44 carpenters and blacksmiths' apprentices, equipped with axes, saws, hammers, battering rams, and other tools. They were protected by 174 armed companions. The entire company was transported on 53 sledges. The carpenters and blacksmiths' apprentices were paid 5 stavers per person for their work, the companions 3 stavers. Before the departure, the necessary beer had been drunk. In addition to these costs, the Gouda City Council also had to compensate for the damage suffered by farmers on the way and the damage caused to the inn located at the crossing near Delft. End quote. The effort and expenditure that Gouda was willing to sacrifice to stop ships from passing through these dams shows how vital the passage inside the dunes had become to the city. The conflict would not end there, as the by now controlling noble Hendrik van Naaldwijk would attempt to rebuild the locks at the Leidschendam in 1492 before Gouda sent men to smash them again. The next year he tried to build them once more, and guess what? The work was once more impeded by force on behalf of Gouda, who also sought not only legal assurance from the Duke's court at Mechelen that they would be forgiven for smashing the locks, which Maximilian had given approval for, but that they could do it again if they had to. After this, the battle continued in the courts. Perhaps because of the turmoil which had been engulfing Flanders around this time, Maximilian and the ducal courts felt they had more pressing issues to deal with. So a fully functioning lock at the Leidschendam would not be completed until 1648, a century and a half later. Throughout this episode, we have seen how waterways, both natural and man-made, shaped the physical and economic landscape of Holland between the 11th and 16th centuries. Through trial, error, conflict, and negotiation, the ways that water and therefore ships and therefore goods were moved through the territories of the Low Countries were created. Throughout the course of this whole podcast, we have seen countless examples of how the towns and cities of the Low Countries developed due to events that range from external wars against foreign states to internal factionalism ripping things apart from within. In broad strokes terms, many of these events did shape the country in the lead up to the 1500s when it would push its way in towards modernity. However, while those events are important, and do not fear, we will be getting back to that stuff soon enough, it is continually important to recognize, especially as we also move our narrative towards modernity, that the waterways, dams, and dikes of this delta are the veins and arteries throughout which the lifeblood of this swampy region flows. Thank you so much for listening to History of the Netherlands. Hooray! We made an episode. You're welcome. To Edwin Den Boer, we really hope that this episode satisfies your Delta lust. To everyone else, don't let this episode make you think that you can just send us a critical message and then we'll make an episode just for you. Like Eugenia, who emailed us saying lots of lovely things, but then requested that we get through the 16th century before she dies. No, Eugenia, don't tell us what to do. We'll spend the next 50 years going through the 16th century if that's the way it's going to take. We know we take ages to make episodes, but it does take a lot of research, and we have been super busy building families and businesses and all kinds of stuff. So thanks as always for your patience. Speaking of businesses, as many long-time listeners will know, we have been a part of Those Damn Boat Guys in Amsterdam for a really long time. Recently, however, a few of us have branched out to build our own bicycle tour and rental partner company called the Amsterdam Bike Pirates. If you're in Amsterdam and want to experience life on 2 wheels with the world at your handlebars, check us out at bikepirates.nl. If you ask us nicely, we'll take you to the Kostverlorenvaart. This podcast could not be possible without the help of so many lovely listeners who have taken the effort to support our show via the Intercursus Magnus Patreonus, which translates from Latin into English as they give us money on patreon.com. Go to patreon.com/history of the Netherlands and join up. You'll get the episodes toll free, and we'll even give your ship priority to get through the lock, meaning you'll get to listen a little bit earlier than all those regular folk. We'd like to give a special shout out to the following lovely people. Frederick. That's a powerful imperial name, Frederick. We're going to call you Barbarossa. Thanks, Barbs. Then there's Kelly Bobby McGee. Hey. Bobby McGee. Then, of course, Laura Israels. Thank you so much. Did you know that the name Laura derives from the bay tree, in Dutch laurierboom, and the bay laurel is one that symbolizes victory. So, for that reason, and not because we're staying 1,000 feet away from making jokes about your last name, we're going to nickname you the best thing you can make with a bay leaf: spaghetti bolognese. Thanks, Laura Spagball Israels. Next up is Kevin Bertram. Kevin from Julian, it was an absolute pleasure meeting you on a boat ride. I was sorry to miss out, but we are still thinking about ways that we can work together and make something great. Kevin makes games through his company, Fort Circle, and they are awesome for history nerds to check out. So go to his website, fortcircle.com. Kevin07, Bertram, cheers very much, fella. And finally, there's Lars. Lars. With a name like that, Lars, I feel like if we tell you too much about our waterways, then you and your heathen mates are going to rock up on boats and loot us all. So instead, we're going to assume you're the drummer of Metallica and just call you Ulrich. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Doei. Thanks for listening to History of the Netherlands. You can get detailed show notes at our website, historyofthenetherlands.com. From there, you'll be able to find other podcasts and projects that we've created. This is a production of Republic of Amsterdam Radio.